We are at the Museum for Angewandte Kunst in Vienna, and it's this year 150 years anniversary. It was a kind of place where they were collecting objects, but it was a kind of as example to share with the public, to as a place for education, but not only for education, but also really share how it was produced, how it was made, and people really could come here as to learn something and to take it at home and go on with it, to copy it even. And I think this is something today we are losing, or if I see the institutions that are in an old paradigm, and although the world itself is going back to these kind of models. I see that also happening in your practice, and what do you think of these kind of evolutions?
I think it's a really fundamental and interesting question that the museum is asking, the MAK is asking, because I think fundamentally, I think there's a really interesting opportunity for museums to become the holders of a new commons IP. You know, what would happen if the MAK and organizations like the MAK turned around and bought the iPhone IP and actually started to open source it, or other IP that's currently held in private use, and actually start to contribute to the commons of design and innovation. And I think that's really where the history of museums really comes from, as you were alluding to. And I think there's a really interesting political and innovational intervention that museums can start to do as real engines of 21st century growth, not just actually curators of history. And I think there's a real powerful kind of literary contribution rather than just a visual contribution, which I think is a very, very, very exciting and interesting repositioning of museums.
In a former discussion, you gave a very interesting example of what happened at the Wellcome Trust, which I think this is maybe kind of key example of how that we can deal with knowledge.
Exactly. I mean, Wellcome Trust is one of the largest trusts, health-focused trusts, and they, in the early 2000s, basically recognized that the human genome had a risk of being entirely privatized. So they spent £200 million in a laboratory in Cambridge, and they effectively open sourced the human genome to prevent it being locked into private interest. So they used their endowment effectively to create a new commons, because they recognized that was a key contribution to actually innovation. And now every pound that they fund, they force it to be open. So any research that they give a pound to, they say that research must be open source. Now that sort of structural political play of contributing to the commons of knowledge, I think is a very powerful, smart repositioning of what I think museums can do, but also trusts and foundations and curators of knowledge can do. What would a 21st century library look like? And if we look back in history, in a way, you know, the fact that we had to give our books to the British Library or their equivalents at the point of publishing, which is a legal right, you know, that was what we legally had to do, was actually a nod towards the need to keep knowledge open. So historically, there has been a need to actually acknowledge this liquidity of knowledge as a fundamental necessity of a healthy society. So I think we have to start to reinvent this stuff for the 21st century. And I think there's some very interesting questions at the center of that, which I think challenge the role of museums and also will make them incredibly relevant. I think potentially more relevant than many other institutions. And that really excites me for them.
Even more relevant, because I was really questioning, by bringing all this stuff together, how can they even deal with authorship, ownership, property? It really seems to me problematic in such a way that you cannot collect it anymore, that it's all over the place and getting intangible. And how can we still centralize that even?
I think you're right, but I think there's an interesting opportunity for, like, in a sense, you build a laboratory for the commons. I think the future will be less about just the kind of having a pristine object, but actually creating the laboratory for people to operate on these objects which exist in the commons for those museums. Or you could even argue it's a sandpit. If you wanted to be I mean, this is a really interesting, it could be a sandpit where the property rights in that space are effectively held in commons. So you can then create a space for innovation. So I think the act of turning it from being an observer, art of the observer, the voyeur, to the art of the engagement is, I think, going to be the fundamental shift in the museums. And that historically, that's where, if you look at where libraries and museums came from, they were laboratories. They were really public laboratories, shared laboratories for actually the intelligentsia. In Cambridge and Oxford, that's what you find. And I think that's where we will start to see. And in these laboratories, people held specimens and objects, and that's where a lot of their pre-industrial heritage comes from. So and I think that becomes really exciting.
Yeah, so it's really like instead of just trying to attract crowd and to do crowd building, you would say these become places for crowd making.
And doing.
We started this discussion with a comparison between the museum as a place for sharing knowledge, where it could become a laboratory. I would like to refer to one of your projects. I think one of the most, in my eyes, one of the most successful projects of the last years, which is dealing with open source, and with the museum also could act as a place for open source. And I would like to link that with your project Open Desk. But first, open source and the museum as a place for open source, an open source culture.
I think the museum, in a sense, can create an environment. Open source is a methodology of creating a commons of knowledge. And I think that commons is what I think is going to be critical in repositioning the museum. Now, open source for me, and as you and I spoke about, is actually coming from a political and economic position. And so did museums. You know, many of museums came from a history of public libraries, as we talked about, and libraries and public laboratories, which is about creating a common shared infrastructure. Now, museums are creating that shared infrastructure in a 21st century way and in a sandbox for a global commons of knowledge. And I think that creates an opportunity that I think is quite potent and vital. Now, the challenge will become is how do we deal with the politics and the economics of these models? Because we're going to see open source being challenged. Open source is going to be challenged by a fractional economy. As the idea of IP, I mean, I've kind of often argued that open source was a convenient truth. In a sense, it's a convenient truth between the politics and the economics. So the economics was the cost of transacting micro IP.
It was too expensive to...
Exactly. Yeah. And the value of collaboration was higher. So people made open source. And the politics of it was that there were a group of people that firmly believed that actually we had to create a post-asset future where it is not about private ownership, but a new commons economy. So we had a convenient marriage, a marriage of convenience. Now that marriage is about to get questioned as the web allows for the cost of transactions has become virtually zero, that actually micro IP is going to come back to the table and aggregation of micro IP is going to become viable. And that neoliberal, in a sense, future is biting back and the politics is deviating. And I think this is, going to be a very interesting challenge for us of how we start to deal with it. And there, the role of museums becomes even more important because as the neoliberal framework starts to create, recapture this model, actually rebuilding this commons is going to again become the sole preserve of public institutions and the role of the public in the 21st century way. So in a way, I think the role of organizations like Wellcome Trust, like the MAK, becomes very critical in rebuilding a new public commons of knowledge as actually fractional IP becomes a powerful container of, capture of wealth again. So this is a balance. And I think in a way you could argue the politics of open source aligns very well with the future of museums. and in a way embracing that politics of creating a new commons economy of knowledge should be the key mantra of museums.
What we collected here is, and what we brought together in effect in a cabinet, which is a kind of private museum that was in the private home, in the domestic environment, and was a kind of private museum for an owner, and he or she could bring together in a random way all kind of stuff to share and to exchange knowledge with the visitors and the inhabitants of the house itself, but it was also a place to show off. So it was really kind of, maybe it was the first museum itself. And today I thought this cabinet of John Stam, where we are presenting also one of your projects where you were involved in, is not only collecting these objects, because I think it's not about the objects alone anymore, it's also about the layer of information, the matter of concern that is around it, and that is somewhere out here around us, and that is surrounding us, and to capture also that information. I think there, and who is owning this information, in fact? Where is the digital and the virtual collected, and to speak in the terminology of a museum? And how will we deal with that in the future? Do you have a clue about that, or?
It's a really interesting and challenging question, because in many ways, there's a really interesting analogy, which is, if you ask, I mean, there's a piece of ethnographic research done around Western children and children in China and Eastern children. And when Western children were asked to look at a painting, they would focus on the object first and describe the thing around it. When you ask an Eastern child, or somebody who had grown up in an Eastern context, they would describe the context and describe the object last. So there's a kind of big cultural behavioral bias in terms of how we're trained. I grew up in the West, so I have a particular bias in that sense. And in a sense, I think objects have always had context around them. And in a way, the data context just means that we can capture and contextualize and give greater access to that context and share the access to that context. So I suppose the kind of interesting thing is that I think museums are going to have to be able to create access to the data context and the wider context in more richer ways, and be able to perhaps sandbox it, perhaps actually deal with the IP around that stuff. And so that's why we were talking about the intellectual property, and the whole integrity of the system around it is probably going to be the greatest thing. And perhaps access to authors, access to producers, access to the networks, access to the ecosystem. So it's no longer about talking about the object, but the ecosystem that produces it. And curating and hosting that is key.
Yeah, but then if I look to, let's say that tomorrow, MAK is going to collect your open desk.
Yeah.
It's impossible.
Yeah, I mean, so Jeffrey Museum, a museum in France, lots of kind of museums have approached Open Desk to collect an item. And what they've ended up collecting is a sample product, a sample print, literally a physical print, as a totem, as a symbol of that future. And what we're starting to capture is almost a symbolic elements of the future, rather than the integrity of the ecosystem. Now, I'm not sure we can capture the integrity, but what we can start to do is capture the kind of the flows of it, capture the flow. And I think there's something more profound to be done between the current round of capture, which is one printed sample of an open desk stool, which is what we're seeing, to actually starting to talk about it as a flow of knowledge, it as a flow of producers, the authorship system at the center of it, which I think is much more interesting and much more relevant. So in a sense, you are providing access to an ecosystem, not just actually capturing a sample. And this is, I think, going to be one of the big shifts from capturing samples to actually providing access to ecosystems and reference connections to people who are producers, makers, to be able to say, how do they do something? It's the human library at the center of this model around it, which I think is going to be key, as well as the data.